So in the previous two videos, we talked about the sense of self-recognition and the sense of ownership, the ways our brain establishes a sense of me as being distinct from the world. And we saw that a lot of it really comes down to this multi-sensory representation, the way the brain keeps track of the simultaneous input from touch and proprioception and vision and everything else and processes it all together to represent ourself as a thing within but separate from the space around us. In this video, I just want to discuss a few more angles on this idea of multisensory or multimodal body representation in the brain and see some more of the plasticity or flexibility of it. So a common assumption in the neuroscientific community pre-1970 or so was that the childhood brain grows and adapts a lot, but once you're past a critical period, it's too late to change. The idea was that the adult brain is fixed, that we don't grow new neurons, and that major functions or structures in the brain don't really change. This idea wasn't out of nowhere, obviously. They had it for good reason. For example, Nobel Prize winners Hubel and Wiesel had performed some neuroscientific studies on kittens and adult cats back around this time. Now, this will sound kind of messed up in terms of invasive research being done on animals, especially ones we know and love, but historically, most of what we've learned in medicine, including neuroscience, has built on significant amounts of research with animal models. So what Hubel and Wiesel did was they took kittens and sewed one eye shut for 6 months. Then afterwards, they looked at the brain of these kittens and found areas of the visual cortex that get signals from the eye that they had sewn. Those areas of the visual cortex had shrunk. And areas that get signal from the open eye, those areas had actually grown larger, those areas of the brain. So indeed, the areas that were used to process signals from the closed eye, they were now firing, because they weren't getting input from the closed eye, they were now firing to process signals from the open eye. So the kitten's brain had adjusted to the temporary loss of that eye. However, when Hubel and Wiesel repeated the experiment on adult cats, and again they sewed one eye shut, even if they sewed it shut for a whole year, they found that the visual cortex in those adult cats didn't change. It didn't update and adapt like it had for the kittens, which, along with a lot of other research around that time, was pretty strong evidence that the young brain is plastic and flexible, while the adult brain isn't. However, after the 70s or so, we had to start revising that idea. It became a little more contentious. For example, in 1984, a scientist named Merzenich mapped out the finger areas in some adult monkeys' brains, the same way that Wilder Penfield had mapped out the primary somatosensory cortex in humans. Remember, he discovered the little homunculus in S1 of humans, that it had the nice body map? Well, Merzenich found the same thing in adult monkeys. Now, as adults, you might expect their brains to not be very adaptable, right? That was the idea at the time. But after he mapped out the monkey's S1, what Merzenich did is he actually amputated the middle finger of his subjects. Yes, it's really morbid and sad, even if they were under anesthesia at the time. But at any rate, 2 months after the amputation, he went back and mapped out the somatosensory area, like the S1 in these monkeys, and the place that used to respond to touches on the middle finger, the neurons that used to fire for touches to the middle finger, we'd say the neurons that had a receptive field on that finger, those neurons, sure enough, 2 months later, started responding to touches on the index finger or the ring finger, so the fingers that are directly adjacent. They didn't respond, the neurons didn't fire to touches on the first or the fifth finger, right, the thumb or the pinky of these monkeys, because those aren't directly adjacent in the somatotopic body map, right? That map that we have in S1. But for the nearby areas, the nearby parts of the body, those started having extra neurons dedicated to them because the brain had all these spare neurons to work with that weren't getting input from the middle finger anymore. So Merzenich and others around this time, they were finding that the adult brain also shows some significant flexibility, some rewiring, that the brain essentially doesn't waste neural real estate. So if neurons in one area stop getting their usual input, they don't just sit there useless. Rather, nearby areas eventually take over, and those previous neurons just take on a new role. This is called cortical plasticity, sometimes just called neuroplasticity, where the brain's wiring, things like the somatotopic map in S1, can adjust and update itself due to changes in the inputs or due to injury, rehabilitation. And we now know that the adult brain does this too, though not nearly to the same extent as the young brain. So a young child can even have an entire hemisphere of their brain removed, called a hemispherectomy. And in some cases, such a kid has even gone on to lead a pretty normal life. One guy even went on to graduate school. However, such widespread damage in an adult brain rarely has such an extensive recovery. It's usually much more severe and permanent. So, since the time of Merzenich, who by the way, won a big neuroscience prize for his work as recently as 2016, since then we found lots of evidence of adult neuroplasticity. One kind of funny example coming out of this is that some people with amputated feet, some people who have a foot amputated, they'll feel a phantom foot, not surprisingly, but they've also reported feeling orgasms located in their phantom foot. Like, this has happened for quite a few cases. They kind of experience an orgasm, but rather than being centered at the genitals or in the whole body, they report it as centered in their foot. And looking back at the somatotopic map, that homunculus we saw in a previous video, note the location of the foot and the location of the genitals in that neural mapping up there in S1. The neurons that go off for touches to the foot are pretty darn close to the neurons that go off for touching to the genitals. So it's possible these anecdotal experiences that people who have an amputated foot have reported actually have a neural basis due to cortical plasticity after the amputation. Foot neurons in S1 are no longer getting any input, so maybe they're starting to process some signals for nearby regions, similar to Merzenich's monkeys. More recently, a 2009 study showed that just wearing a cast actually rewires the somatosensory cortex in adult humans. So after being in a cast, that hand's fingers will lose acuity. So the people in the study who wore a cast for a while, they got worse at the 2-point touch threshold that we learned about previously, meaning they couldn't tell 2 pinpricks from 1 pinprick at pretty close distance. They lost acuity in the fingers of the hand that they weren't using anymore because it was in a cast. But also, throw them in an fMRI scanner, a brain scanner, and we find that those fingers area in S1 had actually become smaller after wearing the cast. And, they weren't using those fingers for a while, so the brain didn't need to process that as much. And the other hand's fingers actually gained acuity, likely because they're starting to use the other hand much more than usual in a compensatory manner. Sure enough, in the brain scans, the fMRI scans, the finger area, those fingers area in S1 was larger on that other side of the brain for that hand that they were now using more than they used to. So after the cast was removed, it did actually return pretty close to normal in just a couple weeks. So cortical plasticity can be on a pretty short time scale, in addition to those longer term or more permanent changes that we've seen. And by the way, the same effect has been demonstrated in rats, where researchers have just temporarily taped up their paws for a little while, and that part of the rat's S1, that part of the rat's primary somatosensory cortex, also shrinks. It's representation of the paws. Now, think for a moment about someone reading Braille. Which part of the brain is likely to be active when reading Braille? Certainly some language areas will be active, right? But even before that, think about the basic sensory input when you're reading Braille. You use your hands. It's a tactile medium, a touch medium. So we would expect S1, the primary somatosensory cortex up in the parietal lobe, to definitely be processing signals from whichever fingers are touching the Braille. Obviously, it'll be on the opposite side of the brain because it's contralateral, but you'd expect S1 activity when reading Braille. And that's totally correct. That's definitely what we see. S1 is active when someone reads Braille, whether the person is a blind person or a sighted person reading Braille. But in people who are blind, we also find that the touch processing areas aren't the only thing that activates when reading Braille. What's interesting is in people who are blind, their occipital lobe, the visual cortex area in the back of the brain, isn't getting the normal visual input. So really, it's just a ton of neurons back there, all with nothing to do. And remember, the brain doesn't like wasting neural real estate. So what we find is that in blind people, the visual cortex is also active when they're reading Braille or doing other tactile tasks like haptic identification tasks, which is pretty amazing when you think about it, because that's a pretty wide scale, large change in the brain. These aren't neighboring neurons or even neighboring areas in the brain, but the brain just has a bunch of processing power back there in the occipital lobe that would be totally wasted otherwise. So eventually, those neurons start firing to process information from the channels that actually are coming in, the sensory information that the blind person is getting, for example, through touch. But that might not actually take a long time. You might think, okay, that would take years. You're blind, you have a long time to get used to that. But it's not necessarily the case. Like, it doesn't just happen in people who are early blind, meaning they're born without sight or lost it very early in life before their brain got experience using the visual cortex for sight. No, it can even happen in sighted people. So, for example, there was a while back a sighted volunteer named Michelle Geronimo participated in a study where she wore a full total blindfold for 5 days straight, getting no light to her eyes during that time. And she also spent a lot of those days studying Braille. And they did some brain scans during the study. And toward the end of those 5 days, the visual cortex was active when she was reading Braille, in addition to S1. Obviously, S1 was active because she was touching something, but also her visual cortex started to have activity when she's reading Braille that it didn't have at the start of the study. Then to further test it, they used TMS, which is transcranial magnetic stimulation, something we talked about in a previous video where you can temporarily turn on or shut down part of the brain in a kind of harmless way. So they used TMS, in this case, to temporarily shut down her visual cortex. So she had learned to use Braille. They saw that her visual cortex was active when she was reading Braille. They temporarily turn off her visual cortex, and she suddenly sucked at Braille, which shows that the activity and the processing that was going on back there in the visual cortex was functional. It was being used for the Braille task. It wasn't just extra bonus firing or epiphenomenal firing or firing causing her to kind of see visual associations when she was feeling something. It seemed to be part of how her brain had learned to process the Braille. So that's a pretty damn fast rewiring of the cortex, showing cortical plasticity on a very short time scale. In fact, things like this have suggested that cortical plasticity shouldn't be thought of as a brand new connection forming between two areas, as if neurons just grow some super long wires and migrate those wires many inches away to somewhere else in the brain. Rather, the speed at which we see this large-scale cortical plasticity suggests we seem to already have a lot of bidirectional connections between different areas of the brain, like different sensory areas. And the neuroplasticity we see is more about changing the activity of those existing connections, strengthening connections at the synaptic level, what's sometimes called synaptic plasticity. The changes are happening where one neuron meets another, basically. And actually, interestingly, when they took the blindfold back off, she got normal vision back, not surprisingly. Her visual cortex was still able to process visual signals. It hadn't lost that. Almost like it just reactivated the existing visual mode. And at that point, after doing that for a while, after back to normal for a while, when they shut down her visual cortex with TMS, she was still able to read Braille fine using just the tactile. It was her S1, or primary somatosensory cortex, that was then the main area active for Braille reading, no longer using the visual cortex because it was busy using, processing visual signals at that point. Some other examples of plasticity in body representation actually come from the phantom limb literature. So, for example, in a 2009 study, Mosley and Brugger asked their patients who had phantom limbs to visualize moving their phantom into impossible configurations, like ways the body can't normally bend. They just had them consistently over and over again practice visualizing that. And after doing this for a while, the participants started reporting feeling a new wrist joint, feeling the presence of a new wrist joint in their phantom, not on the other side, just on the phantom side. So kind of like their phantom was able to move in ways that aren't normally anatomically possible for a human wrist. But again, This wasn't just something interesting that was self-reported by the participants. They also did behavioral tests. Like, for example, the participants then did a mental rotation task, which you've probably seen those before, like these rotated Tetris pieces. That's a mental rotation task. But they did a mental rotation task of hand pictures. And the participants actually mentally rotated faster than other control participants because they could imagine their own hand going through that shorter, impossible new joint path, suggesting their brain had kind of integrated that representation of this is how that hand works. So our body representation up there in the brain, in S1 and beyond, it's flexible and it is affected by experience and change to the body. We can actually see now that the body representation, it's something that's constructed, actively constructed in the brain. It's updated and it's reprogrammed through integrating multisensory input from a bunch of different sensory channels, which is why mirrors can help phantoms, right? The people with phantom pain, we saw the mirror box therapy was one thing that can work really well because they provide unusual new sensory input to override that old programmed in body representation. The body representation isn't just from touch or proprioception. It isn't just from our direct somatosensory systems, but also it's this larger scale multisensory thing that's affected even by vision and other senses. But that raises the question, why is our bodily sense of self so damn flexible? But it actually makes sense when you think about it for a minute. When you think about our life from an ontogenetic perspective, meaning a life course development perspective, because we develop, we grow, our body changes, and the brain has to represent and feel a sense of ownership over our body despite the growth and the changes that occur over time. Like, obviously, childhood has very fast changes in our basic sizes and proportions, and puberty too, for that matter. And aging also brings changes to the body. People often shrink a little bit as they get older, right? Not to mention more acute changes, like from an amputation. Your brain has to be able to adjust to that so that you can learn to balance despite having less weight there on one side. Now, localizing your body and its parts within three-dimensional space, that has to be done very quickly in order to move through the world and interact with things. So if we want to be able to do this quickly, to process quickly, to react quickly, the brain is actually going to learn to rely on kind of its memory about how multisensory signals usually occur in normal situations. These brain shortcuts and heuristics, they're normally correct. They normally work. But of course, they can't always account for these weird, unusual situations in a lab, like when we do the rubber hand illusion or after someone has brain damage. But it still does its best in those cases to produce a single, unified body representation. And that means in the weird lab situations, it might lead to a mislocation or a misrepresentation of our body parts, right? The illusions that we've seen. And studying these illusions, be they phantom limbs or rubber hands or whatever else, can thus help us understand the normal sensory processes. Maybe a takeaway lesson here, we've seen before that perception doesn't represent the world with perfect accuracy. It is our brain's best guess. And now we can see that even our bodily sense of self is a construction. It's constructed in the brain. Now, before we move on, I did want to mention a few other interesting conditions that relate to body representation from the literature. So, for example, there's a condition called supernumerary phantom limb, where supernumerary just means extra number. So it's when someone has a phantom of an extra limb. There was a case study, for example, in 2009, where this 64-year-old woman had a stroke and then started seeing and feeling a third arm sticking out of her left arm. She described it as a pale, milky white, translucent extra limb. She felt it kind of clenched, and she just had this vivid feeling of there being an extra hand there. She actually claimed she could touch her normal limb with the supernumerary phantom, and when she did, she felt the touch on the normal limb and also on the phantom itself. She even said she could scratch an itch with the imaginary hand, and the itch went away. Now, they did an fMRI scan on her and asked her during this to touch her cheek with the supernumerary phantom. And at those times, the cheek part of S1 of her primary somatosensory cortex was active. The somatosensory part of her brain fired like her cheek was being actually touched, despite the fact nothing was physically touching it. So her report of feeling that extra phantom limb was most likely very real to her. She wasn't delusional. She knew the sensations were unrealistic, but they were there. The perception was real. It felt real. There have actually been a number of other cases like this as well, so it's not just a one-time thing, though it's obviously very rare. In an interesting study by Magiuch, who we saw earlier studied xenomelia with the researcher Ramachandran, they found that 62% of transgender men who were assigned female at birth, but then received gender confirmation surgery, like a phalloplasty, those people reported that they had had sensations of a phantom penis pre-surgery. So 62%, quite a few. And actually, maybe more interestingly, the researchers also looked at people who had penectomies, meaning surgical amputation of a penis. And that's usually done for two reasons, right? Sometimes it's done for cancer that can require removal of the penis, or sometimes it's done for gender confirmation surgery, for trans women. And what they found was that people who had had their penis removed for cancer were significantly more likely to experience a phantom penis after the amputation, a rate of 58% versus only 30% for the other group. Those who like consciously hadn't felt that the penis was part of their body, who had a dysphoric feeling of being born in the wrong body, so to speak, they were less likely to have a phantom of that part, which suggests their penis had less cortical representation to begin with. Because as we've seen and are seeing here again, the body representation is based in the brain. Phantom limb is a brain condition, right? And here, phantom penis, it's about the brain representation. Another intriguing phenomena related to body representation occurs in what's called Alice in Wonderland Syndrome. You may remember that in Lewis Carroll's writing, there are points at which Alice's body is really out of proportion with her environment. Well, in this syndrome, Alice in Wonderland Syndrome, people experience a messed up perception of size or shape, often the size or shape of their body, and it's usually as a side effect of having either micropsia or macropsia. So micropsia is just a visual hallucination sometimes people get where objects are perceived to be much smaller than they actually are. They just look smaller than they are, which of course then makes the subject feel like their body is larger than normal by comparison with what they're seeing in the environment. And then macropsia is kind of the opposite of that. It's a visual hallucination where objects are perceived to be much larger than they actually are, which again will cause the subject to feel a lot smaller than normal relative to the things they're seeing in the environment. One description of Alice in Wonderland Syndrome actually puts it this way. The most prominent and often most disturbing symptom is that of altered body image. The sufferer will find that they are confused as to the size and shape of parts of or all of their body. And it's actually Alice in Wonderland Syndrome. It usually happens due to migraines. It can happen with brain tumors, when someone's having seizures, sometimes with certain drugs, and with extreme lack of sleep. Which, actually, this is an interesting connection when you look it up and realize that Lewis Carroll, who wrote Alice in Wonderland, he was known to have migraines, including visual manifestations, pretty regularly for years. And all of it he had reported on prior to writing Alice's Adventures. So the creative tales that he told may actually have been inspired by him having this syndrome during the migraines. One other cool example of flexible body representation is an illusion that can be induced in the laboratory by messing with proprioceptive input, basically doing a version of the tricks we saw before with proprioception. So Longo and colleagues, back in 2009, they did this study causing a sensation of a shrinking arm, what they described as a contraction of body representation induced by proprioceptive conflict, proprioceptive input. So you can get an idea how they did it from just the abstract here, which really ties together some of the info we've already learned in this course. So let me just read that. Our body is not only an extended object in external space, but also the basis of our sense of self. Proprioceptive signals from muscle spindle organs, right? Remember we learned about muscle spindles, specifying body position, play a key role in this unique dual quality of body representation, as they define a here, or a set of locations where I am located, right? That sense of what's me and what's not. Position information from muscle spindles can be manipulated by vibrating the muscle tendon, generating illusions of position and movement. For example, biceps vibration generates illusions of the elbow extending, while triceps vibration generates illusions of flexion. Here, in this study, they report that proprioceptive conflict induced by simultaneous vibration of antagonistic biceps and tricep muscle tendons. In other words, they vibrated both at the same time. They made it feel extension and flexion at the same time. That alters representation of the body in a way that is qualitatively different from single vibrations. Rather than just sensing relocation or movement of the arm, this inherent conflict, so making it feel like moving one way and moving the other way at the same time, this inherent conflict of location produces perceived telescoping of the arm towards the elbow. Loss of coherent information about body position in space seems to produce contraction of the body representation itself. So their results suggested that the basic sensory signals about body posture also play an essential role in representing the self as an extended object in space, how far out we go into space. Thought that was an interesting example. It kind of ties back into what we learned about proprioception. Now, it turns out some of this understanding about how the brain represents our body schema, right, as this brain representation of the body, it's been applied to help treat pain. So for example, there was a 2011 study where they used a painful heat stimulus and measured how long someone could withstand the heat before withdrawing their hand from the pain. Turns out, if you're looking at your hand, you can hold out longer compared to a control condition where they were just looking at a wooden block. But then, the researchers manipulated the visual image, making the hand appear larger or smaller. So it's this illusion, right? Think of it kind of like looking at your hand through binoculars or reverse binoculars. So making the hand appear larger while watching the pain applied actually increased people's pain tolerance, while making the hand appear smaller decreased their pain tolerance. So sometimes distraction might not be the best way to minimize pain. Like they suggest that this might be similar to the pain gating mechanism, the gate model that we learned earlier in the course, where other signals can compete with or maybe inhibit those slow C-fiber nociceptive signals by sending signals down from the central nervous system. In this case, the visual input may have some connections back to the somatosensory area and back to those central mechanisms that might, interact with the gate control mechanisms. That same year, actually, some different researchers, Preston and Newport, they made a kind of neat display box to create a visual illusion of the participant's hand shrinking or stretching out, like you can kind of see here on the right. And they found that manipulating the visual of the hand relieved people's arthritis pain. So these are just a couple examples of trying to use bodily illusions or manipulations of the body representation in order to treat pain. And if you're interested, there have actually been some good review papers on this topic, including a 2016 systematic meta-analysis of studies that I've cited here in the lower left. They discuss, in this paper, body resizing illusions, mirror therapy, virtual walking, prosthetics, embodiment illusions, incongruent movement illusions, and a lot more. So if you're interested, you can read. It was published in the journal Pain, which is a big pain research journal, a few years ago. At any rate, we'll end this video here and move on to the last video for the current topic, where we're going to talk about the sense of embodiment, including how that can go wrong and things like out-of-body experiences.